Oh, I seem to have lost the sound.
I think they're muted, Ken. I think you're okay. I think they're just muted.
Oh,
Okay,
really?
good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. It's my pleasure to introduce Barry Bergdoll to start the program.
Good afternoon, those in New York. Good morning, those on the West Coast. Bom tarde for those who are in Portugal and in Europe. Welcome, everybody. This is a great honor. It falls to me to open the event, which is a celebration of the belated but beautiful publication in an English language edition of Alvaro Siza's book, Imagining the Evident, published by Monad Books, with Daniela Sa, who will be introducing the book in just a moment. I think Siza needs no introduction. One of the few benefits of Zoom and of webinars is that we can all around the world be with him at the same time. I don't think there's a single person on screen who is actually physically in the architecture school at Columbia, but it falls to me as a Columbia faculty member to represent the school and the Dean Amal Andros to welcome you on behalf of the school. There's a great deal of information on each of the panelists this afternoon on the website of GSAP, so I'm not going to read what is there if you want the full bios and backgrounds of each of the speakers, but I'll tell you a little bit about the order that will be following. Daniela Sal, who is the publisher of Monad Books and the founder. Monad Books not only brings us this title, but a whole collection of wonderful works on Portuguese and in Brazilian architecture, in particular recent works on Sao Paulo and on Mendes de Rocha. And I think it is between Siza and Mendes that there is now a kind of renewed architectural design and urban relationship between Portugal and Brazil, which is reflected in the publication program of Monad. So she'll explain the book, and then we will, in sequence, not the sequence on the website, but the sequence I'm about to explain to you, each of us speak for a few minutes about Siza's work, about the book in particular. It's a wonderful compilation of texts and of reproductions of some of Siza's amazing drawings. After Daniela, we'll turn to Francesco Dal Co, who's joining us from Venice. I'm sure you all know his extensive bibliography, his many years as the editor of Casabella, and so he will be the first to speak. Then I will follow. I'm professor of architectural history at Columbia University, and perhaps the least directly connected to Siza. And then after me will speak Peter Testa, who's joining us from the other Venice, as he just told us a few minutes ago, on the other side of the globe in California. But that was his destination after some time working directly with Siza, and also being a faculty member in the 1990s at GSAP. So we all remember, or those of us who are old enough remember your time with us, Peter, and thank you for joining. And then finally, we'll turn to Ken Frampton, who I would say personally is not only one of my mentors, but it was through Ken Frampton that I was first motivated to seek out the work of Siza on a first trip to Portugal many years ago. And so Ken seemed to Daniela and I as the best speaker to close the formal session, and then we will move into what you're all waiting for, so you have to stay online for a while, a chance to converse with Alvaro Siza and to answer your questions that you might put into the question function. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the proceedings over to Daniela Sal, congratulating her for the publication of this book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bergdoll, and thank you also on Columbia to host this event. It's really a pleasure. I would like also to thank the Rolex Institute because with their support, this book was possible to be made, and their support of our work is very important also. And I would like to thank to all the panelists here present, to Kenneth Frampton, Francesco Dal Co, Barry Bergdoll, Peter Testa, and also, of course, Alvaro Siza to be here with us. It's always a pleasure to have these sharing moments and able to share it with a larger audience. And it's also to them that I direct my acknowledgements to our audience, also in Portugal. As I know, many students from Portugal are also attending this session, and across the globe, which is really wonderful and very dear to us also as a publisher. Today we are all gathered here on this book that I have here in hand, and I will just show some images. Okay. So I believe that you are seeing the image of the book, right? So,
Your screen is not shared, Daniela.
It's not shared, so I will have to share it here. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, here. Okay, right. So we are all here around this book, which is wonderful. And so this book, Imagining the Evident, it could well have a title, another title, like How Did I Do Some of My Projects? And I always have this difficulty in finding a more defining question one could ask to oneself, and a more courageous task to share it with others. So this is okay. So this is a very dear testimony of a life of work, of an architectural thinking about his own process. So it is quite a testimony to have now it edited in English. It was already published in Italian. The original edition is Italian from '98, and it was edited by the late collaborator, the Italian Guido Gregorio. So now it has its English edition, and of course that this book is also a conversation. It was made, it is a result of 3 long recorded sessions, all of them along his design process. So in here we can find Siza in his own words, describing anxieties, describing resources, references, conquers or obstacles during his own process of project. But of course that if we have here a book on an author explaining his own method, we don't have here like a process that one can follow to his own work. So it is a testimony on how inventing or creating architecture, or creating a new design. It can be a new chapel or a museum or simply a share. And these are texts from the book. Oh, sorry. Okay. So it is always addressing to this question on how did some person can do some of his own designs. And it begins with a very defining quote. So it begins with this sentence that says, to begin with the obsession of originality is an unrefined and rudimentary process. So we are here confronting with a text that might address the novelty, the creation, the new. And the first thing that it says to us, at that beginning with that obsession of the new as a new form, may not be quite a good way. And the structure itself starts with this question, with this sentence, this statement that repeat is never to repeat. It's again another defining statement, also as the title. The title itself seems to contain a kind of contradiction, because we have on one side imagining, which is creating something, and on the other side the evident. So the fact, something that we can see with our own eyes. And this contradiction is really interesting because the two relates to each other. What is more impressive in this text is that he addresses the idea of the novelty by ideas of, or by concepts of such as banality. And Siza says, and I'm quoting, banality has an ambiguous meaning. Here, says Siza, I'm not using it to say uninteresting or without quality, but in the sense of availability in continuity. And then, and this sentence is very, very precise, the exercise of observation is a priority for an architect. So this double sense of imagining and creating the new at the same time that he focused our attention on the act of seeing. In some way, as the new itself is already there, and it would be for us to have this exercise of seeing. And this is an idea that Siza reports many times. This act of seeing that is built with a lot of practice and a lot of experiences. But it is like, I think that this is a very defining idea, a very wonderful idea to think of, that in some way to consider something new already there, but we have to learn how to see it. And that's why this concept of new, it's constantly during the book put it away of the new forms and originality and breaking new from scratch, but it's like an exercise, a deep exercise of seeing, of a kind of practice of attention to reality. In that attention on reality is also very visible, very evident on his drawings. This act of constant drawings. And as we are speaking now in our table, you cannot see, but in our table are large scale hand drawings that were here when we arrived. So it's a constant presence, this act of exercising the eye and exercising the hand. To be able to see something that is already there, but we cannot see it yet. And that, I think, is a very wonderful idea to consider the new thing. And the ability of the new thing to have some kind of naturality, some kind of obvious, some kind of evident. And here we meet the title again, imagining what is evident. It is already there, but not any one of us can be able to see. So I think that what is more treasurable in this book, and I will show here some pages briefly, is this kind of lesson that we get here on an architect that explains his own work. Is that we should not follow, because we don't have here like a process or a method to copy. We have here a position through the world, facing the reality. And that position, that capability of see the world is very intense on the drawings, but also on the way in which he writes and describes reality and contexts and situations and details, as we can see here. So all these drawings are always working drawings. As I can see also in the text is always a working text. It's a text from the point of view of who creates. It's kind of a theory of design, not that theory of architecture, but the theory of behind the persons who have this practice of project. And so the book ends a bit with this autobiographical note, which is very interesting, and also the drawing that accompanies it, which is an author facing himself in the mirror. I think that will be kind of final testimony on this position of the artist, of the architect, which is to find in his own process a way of relating to the world, a way of seeing the intelligence in the reality, and with that working on the creation of new projects. So I think that this book addresses many architects to look inside also, and to also try to go on this exercise of how do I do some of my projects. And this can be very defined to one, because it's also a very problematic exercise. But I think that this is what makes this book very, very a great testimony. So I am very much looking forward to see what all the panelists will have to comment on. And once again, thank you so much for being present and being present here to share ideas on this wonderful book. We have this lucky to have also Siza with us. So I'm very much looking forward to have this meeting and this talk at the end of the presentations. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bergdoll. We will pass on to Francesco.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody. It's nice to see also through this mechanical tool so many friends around the world. Thank you, Daniela, for sending me the book which obliged me to go back more or less to 23, 25 years when I read for the first time the essays collected in this book. In this book, it's absolutely appropriate, the title that had been used when the book was published for the first time. Imagining the evident implies the strong and fundamental distinction between imagination and invention, which is a topic that Daniela Saar sublined in her essay published in the English edition of the book, and which I think is absolutely fundamental to understand the meaning of Siza's work. Imagining and not invention. Imagining is to discover what is hidden when everything is apparently evident. The evidence of the things is not real if not explained and enlightened by the imagination. The evidence without imagination is just a mute word, just a word which doesn't mean anything. Imagination implies, first of all, the attitude to give an interpretation of what is just already there. And this was one of the greatest passages of one of the essay I would quote to honor Siza in this occasion, because the fact that I read these essays, as I said, more or less 20, 25 years ago, implied for me an exercise today. What does Siza represent for me? What does his work represent for me? Because several of the statements I read in those essays appeared continuously in my work as a kind of continuous reference that consciously or unconsciously I use it continuously. The exercise of the observation. I think that this is one of the key to understand why Siza is continuously drawing. Drawing for him is an exercise to observe, to analyze, to exercise imagination. his works are not a naturalistic expression of what is there, but always interpretation of what the things transfer to the image and what the imagination could and can do about the materials that the evident offer to us. There is no drawing without imagination, and Siza is always drawing because this is an exercise of imagination, which brings him to nourish what he explained in one of the essays Daniela published in this new book, which is the second spontaneity. There is a spontaneous relationship we have. The first spontaneous relationship we have with the evident. Afterwards, there is a second spontaneity, which is nourished instead by the imagination. And I think that this is one of the most important characteristics of the most important works by Siza, and is the key to understand this continuous investigation about the reality which is hidden under the evident, represented by his drawings, by his continuous activity as in drawing. This implies also, and it is a direct consequence of the meaning of what evidence is for Siza, the fact that there is a kind of returning appreciation, returning eloge, returning love for the idea of banality. Banality is another aspect. It's another word which can be used as equivalent of evident. Also, under the banality, also the banality implies the use of the imagination. What is banal always is a challenge for imagination. And this is an aspect which is perfectly represented, as far as I understood, in Siza architectural work. At the end of all that, there is an attitude which is really deeply modern, deeply rooted in one of the great problems of our age. Beauty for Siza is when the beauty is empty of beauty. Beauty is the beauty without beauty, without the research of beauty. Beauty is the byproduct of this dialogue. It's an extraordinary passage I can read. The true beauty is the beauty emptied of beauty. This is one of the most interesting aspects I think we can perceive in Siza's work. And it is one of the gifts that he gave to us. Obviously, this it's a kind of synthesis of all what he did during his architectural career. But are beauty emptied of beauty? Beauty is not a need. Beauty is the attitude which can be reached through the imagination, not through the invention. You don't invent beauty. You find beauty when you are able to empty your activity from the need of beauty. And this is very important and implies also something which is, in my opinion, extremely meaningful to understand the condition we are living in our age. There is a phrase that was used in one of the great texts written in 1927, the famous lecture that Hugo von Hofmannsthal gave in Munich, at the presence, for instance, of Thomas Mann, to give you an idea. when the German title, I don't know the English translation of this, but I try to do it. The German title is Das Schriftum als geistiger Raum der Nation. The title means the work of writing. In this German word, das Schriftum implies the idea of work. It's not just an exercise, it's work, this work which become geistiger, spiritual, and become the spiritual realm, the spiritual space, which is the space which identify a nation. This great question, which is at the bottom of this fundamental speech that von Hofmannsthal gave in 1927, implies this final statement, which, in my opinion, should conclude any way of thinking, any attempt to understand the real meaning of the greatest works by Siza. I tried to translate it in English, but obviously, to be correct, I should say it before in German. Die Vulgarität des Plebs ist die bösesten im literarische, I would translate architektonischen Beruf. The vulgarity of the plebs is the most wicked in the architectural profession. O vulgaridade da plebe è a mais perversa da profissão architettonica. La volgarità della plebe, vulgarity of plebs. This is really something which is so far from any of the most important work, from the attitude, I would say, from the moral attitude of cities, the vulgarity of plebs, to stay away from all what is vulgar. For this reason, I think that Alvaro Siza is one of those human beings which, in my opinion, are part of the spiritual nation of which I am honored to be part. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. I made a mistake in suggesting you go first because now it's very hard to follow you after that. Wonderful, insightful homage. So I've written something just not to be too long and to leave time for us to hear from Peter and Ken. For me, it's a really huge honor to be part of this panel this afternoon, as I have, first inspired by Ken Frampton's teaching and writings, been seeking out Siza's buildings on trips now for over 30 years. And I am proud to have been able, working with Pedro Gadagno, to have brought some of Alvaro Siza's projects into the collection of the Museum of Modern Art during my tenure there. These included some of the types of drawings that are as much the argument of the text collected together in imagining the event evident, as they are an invitation to think about the very nature, seems to me, of the act of architecture. The book itself, as we've heard, is 23 years old, given to us now in English in this beautiful design and presentation, thanks to the mentorship program of Rolex, where Siza performed one more of his countless acts of generosity, as he is as much a teacher and educator in Porto and beyond as one of the most consequential architects of our time. One is struck from the very first sentence that this is at once a volume of reflections that is quite unlike most statements of that time, the 1990s, even as it resonates with the longest traditions of architectural thinking and theory. Indeed, the idea of respect for tradition and a refusal of the avant-garde fetish of originality is characteristic of Siza's position and of his work from the outset, as he began work with Fernando Tavora. One of the first lines of the first essay in the book, Siza says, architecture has no meaning unless in relation to nature. That, it seems to me, might be read either as a prediction of the environmental and climatic crisis that is fundamental to our existence now, 2 decades later, 2 decades after these lines were first printed in Italian, and to the very opening lines at the same time, and to the argument of the Abbé Lauger's 1753 essay on architecture. Lauger's collection of 6 texts on buildings, a kind of similar collection of essays on building, landscape design, and city, is often considered a very starting point of modern architectural thought. A text that was at once a fundamental revision and yet at the same time a reflection upon the oldest book on architecture that we have, that of Vitruvius. But nature for Siza is neither a metaphor for Enlightenment reason, nor of its child, structural rationalism, as in Lauger. For Siza is as much interested in human nature, which for him has as much to do with our inner being as with some higher disembodied reason. He speaks of, these are some of the many phrases I love, I wonder how they are rendered from Portuguese, but they're fantastic in English. He speaks of tough intuition, and in another passage of instinctive wisdom. The human animal is more than a reasoning brain, calculating loads and spans. She or he is an inhabitant of a complex world of sensations and reactions that draws much from the unwritten and the unspoken. The drawings in the book, it seems to me, are somewhere between that unspoken and the utterances that accompany them. I would like very much in the second part of this seminar to hear Siza reflect again on these provocative inventions of his tough intuition and instinctive wisdom, as to hear about some of the many projects that have developed from his intuition and wisdom since these words were crafted over 2 decades ago. Nature for Siza, as he writes and draws in such symbiotic harmony, is more about the nature of the site, the inhabitation of the site, of the terrain, of the place, as it is about an abstracted notion of nature in the 18th century sense, or in the ecological consciousness per se, as it has developed over the decades since Siza's own early practice. It is trees qua trees, rather than trees as metaphor for structure. And it is a sense of place that is at once as pragmatic as Vitruvius's notion that the choice of site is the first skill and contribution of the architect, and something nonetheless that transcends any prelapsarian nostalgia. Nor is it simply a pragmatic relationship to resources, to a healthy respect for solar orientation, for water resources, or prevailing winds, as in Vitruvius's first book. Siza's nature is also the poesis of the site, embodied in the story recounted in the book of Fernando Tavora's laconic analysis of the challenge of building the Boa Nova project for Siza's hometown of Matosinhos, that first brought attention internationally to his design genius. The building should be here, he quotes Tavora as saying. Tavora said that of the difficult site wedged between the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean and the passing traffic. During these initial works, Siza relates, as the book veers into an autobiographical passage relating a significant moment of encounter between pragmatics and poetics at the genesis of each of his own projects. And he continues, an irrepressible and prevailing idea began to blossom, that architecture does not end anywhere. It goes from object to space, and by consequence to the relations among spaces until it encounters with nature. Siza continues with a line written in the 1990s, but I think even more powerful today. So again, Siza, me reading back to you, Siza, your words. This continuity, which may also exist among all its eventual dissonances, is currently in crisis, and natural locations are beginning to suffocate, even though it is quite clear that architecture has no meaning unless in relation to nature. Continuity is perhaps the concept that ties together all of Siza's commitments, the very ethos of his practice, for it applies to the reciprocal relations of building and site, of architecture and nature, but also of architecture and human perception of time, and of the designing impetus of the architect in relation to the history of architecture. The reflection on the nature of influences, a word I always prefer to replace by the more active interests. This reflection on the nature of influences on Frank Lloyd Wright or on Aalto, on Breuer that occur in the book is something that I think should be very instructive for students of architecture. I can see that there are at least 200 of you listening. Siza's is a conception of the human as part of nature, not in dialogue with nature. Human activity is in dialogue with nature such that Siza can speak beautifully of intuiting the site to find the precise location. The place that is, as he writes, and this is another absolutely beautiful phrase, the site that is ready to receive geometricity. As you can see, the texts, as much as they seem as short as prose poems, are also like compressed soil, filled with richness, potent not only for understanding Siza's practice over many decades, but for undertaking architectural design or architectural criticism and history today. What is beautiful in this volume is the complete absence of photographs of the finished buildings, partly perhaps because each of the projects is so well known, but also because the book is about the hand and the mind of the architect before construction begins. The choice and placement of Siza's drawings integrated with the text is exquisite. The two work in symbiosis and continually reinforce this notion of the search for continuity. Excuse me for a moment to bring the perspective here of the art historian, but it was this symbiosis of text and reproduced drawings that made me understand, perhaps even intuit in Siza's words, the profound meaning of the frequent extension of Siza's thin but powerfully drawn lines that form the building's volumetrics into the larger space of the sketchbook sheet. Or are they projected from the space into the sheet to form the building? Just as the buildings are about continuity with nature, atmosphere, and site. And it made me reflect on the fact that Siza, in part inspired perhaps by Le Corbusier's graphic demeanor, prefers over and over again perspective views from above or below the horizon line, rarely asserting the canonic Renaissance two-point perspective with its insistence on the horizon, an artifact, in fact, of human optics rather than of nature. It is this decentering that marks already a fundamental continuity between nature and architecture, between the site and the designing builder. As a historian and one who has taught many students who have passed through this school, I am especially drawn to reflect on Siza's words about the history of architecture, about great masters, about the process of accumulating influences over the decades between study and the mature work of an architect, always striving. These words strike me as a way to close this small appreciation of Siza's huge contribution to architecture, captured in this exquisitely modest volume. The passage comes after mentioning his readings of Gideon as a student and his joint admiration of Alvaro Aalto and of Frank Lloyd Wright. So here are Siza's words, and I think they're really resonant for students of architecture. He says, I believe that the meaning of apprenticeship in architecture is precisely to broaden one's range of references. At the outset, there is always a charismatic figure that captures our interest. And here I like this shift that's occurring in what Siza's saying from influence to interest. So at the outset, there is always a charismatic figure that captures our interest and consequently has decisive influence on us. The articulation of these influences, he continues, is an unrepeatable act of creation. An architect works by manipulating memory. There is no doubt about that, both consciously and most of the time, subconsciously. Knowledge, information, the study of architects and the history of architecture tend or should tend to be assimilated until they fall into the oblivion of the unconscious or subconscious. I should end there, but I also want to ask Alvaro Siza if he might later on say a word about a building that continues to occupy my thoughts for months and months after each time I visited. Each time I encounter the Ibero-Camargo Foundation Museum in Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil, where I had spent much time while we were preparing an exhibition. At MoMA, I came away obsessed with that building. It is a building in which inevitably, and I'm sure Francesco Dal Co will agree with me, in which inevitably Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim was one of the subconscious thoughts. But it is a building so profoundly original, so intensely and unexpectedly engaged with a site. Once again, a site hard on a waterfront and a highway, as in the early moments of Siza's designing for the seafront in Matosinhos, that I see there the possibility for the editor of the revised version of this beautiful book to illustrate that beautiful thought about the continuity of our own intellectual development, not only with nature, but with the history of human creativity. So thank you so much for this wonderful book and for the invitation, Daniela, and Alvaro Siza for the beautiful words, which I think is a little book that one can consult over and over again. And I'll pass on to Testa.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Francesco and Barry, for really wonderful observations and setting up a great conversation here. I also want to thank Daniela for her wonderful introduction and the GSAPP for hosting this conversation with Siza. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack. And I'd like to highlight 3 allegorical pieces in the book. But first, I wanted to set up a scene or set the scene by describing the Siza office and model of practice during the 1980s and early 90s when these texts were written. This is a period that coincides when I worked as a collaborator in Siza's atelier, and I realized in rereading the book the certain familiarity with a number of these pieces during that time. So the office at that time, as I came to know it in 1984, was in what was called the Patio d'Alegria and occupied a U-shaped wooden pavilion above a garage and hidden behind a nondescript office block on the Rua d'Alegria on a hill above the center of Porto. At that time, we were 5 or 6 young collaborators working on an ad hoc collection of drafting tables. There was no receptionist, secretary, publicist, computers, plotters, or any of the things that make up the contemporary office landscape. Drawings were produced with high precision using ink on canson paper, intolerant of mistakes. Siza did not have a set space, but was, as I remember, always in motion and often in a cloud of smoke. A hybrid of artist studio, artisan's workshop, drafting room, and archive, the salient impression was that of a chantier, a temporary office set up on the building site of some impossible project. This was a veritable nomadic office, a provisional space able to absorb the presence of builders, artisans, manufacturers, students, material suppliers, journalists, and clients. So the Siza office offered another take on interdisciplinarity, a generosity where architecture, the disciplines and crafts are on an equal footing, and whose emphasis was on producing unstable, integrative objects that are never finished. So Siza often in those days, and I think continues to work generally with a single collaborator assigned to one or more projects. And he invariably initiated projects with drawings and annotations taken from his infamous Caderno Preto, the black A4 notebooks that he was never without. These drawings were paired with other drawings, geometric matrices, and all sorts of models. Siza's sketches are not impressionistic, but lucid, precise, and comprehensive, much like his writing, in one case about saying, and in the other about seeing. Both his writings and sketches are allegorical in that they illustrate or convey semi-hidden or complex messages. To read these drawings required a process of unlearning, an apprenticeship in learning to see free of interpretation. Work proceeded not so much step by step, but as an all-at-onceness in which all the elements of the project are present at the outset, like wholes that cannot be taken apart. A syntax without synthesis that defines the special character of, in my mind, every Siza work. In those years, work literally extended onto building sites, continuing to refine, adjust, and expand on the initial idea. I recently had the opportunity to revisit the sketchbooks as guest curator in Siza's archive at the CCA, where there are 300 of something like 500 plus cadernos that form one of the largest collections of exploratory drawings of any architect in the history of the discipline. What most resonates with the writings in Imagining the Evident, as I think Daniela so beautifully stated at the outset, is the commitment to new ways of seeing as the first means by, or re-seeing also as Francesco Dal Co suggested, as the first means by which architecture becomes speculative. Siza's interface and particular way of seeing has a latent multiplicity of perception that we are now just beginning to grasp. In those days, Siza was his own cloud and the cadernos his portable flash drive. Turning more directly to Imagining the Evident, I'd like to briefly highlight 3 stories that stand out particularly to me. In the opening sentence in Navigating Through Hybrid Cities, Siza writes, "I have always had difficulty defining the boundary between plan and project." This simple statement compresses decades of working on the city, from the Sala experience in Porto to the reconstruction plan for the historic core of Lisbon, shown here after the fire of 1988, where he relaunches the idea of the gaiola, and more recently reestablished connections between the multiple strata of Lisbon's core, to the expansion plan for Macau involving 2 vast urban platforms detached from the coast. And when seen with the social housing at Évora, designed and built over decades, beginning in the 1970s, and his community-based projects from this period for The Hague, but also Venice and Berlin, Siza's trajectory describes the most complex praxeography of the architecture of the city post-Siam, Rossi, and La Tendenza. So the second topic, the second piece that I'd like to just briefly address engages the idea of transforming conventions. In particular, the piece is titled simply House and Church, speak to an idea of architecture as both artistic and cultural practice. Discussing the Marco de Canaveses church, one of several masterpieces in this small book, Siza articulates the complex and uncertain process of addressing changes in liturgy, in both liturgy and society, and their pressure on conventional architectural elements and models of space that make up a church. Transformations that ultimately lead to an inversion of the apse, which in Marco de Canaveses is no longer concave, but convex. In his words, an intuition to preserve the relationship between the objects and movements that are part of the celebration, the church took on the form of a negative sculpture in which relationships of continuity and tension were established between the various parts. So in this piece, Siza clearly articulates an idea of architecture as a rule-bound representational form, artistic in that it is an art of its own, and cultural since it has rules and is its own representational genre. Speaking to his overarching idea, to repeat is never to repeat. While the elements of architecture are known, the outcome is open from the beginning so as to produce something that cannot be known beforehand. Essentially, the last piece in the book uses his vast but still relatively little known furniture collection as a vehicle to probe the limits of design. A great aphorism here is his statement, "My main concern when designing, let's say, a chair, is it should look like a chair." Moving towards serial production, he remarks, "The quality of the result depends on the pursuit of both autonomy and the ability to establish relations." Concisely articulating the principle that solitude in the world is the condition of distinction for belonging to an aggregate, Siza defines banality as availability in continuity. As is often the case in these texts, Siza speaks to new configurations of time sequencing and history and tries to liberate architectural knowledge by using its generic potential. Essentially, he posits the paradoxical idea that a great work of art must be at once generic and yet contain something absolutely unique, as he says, at once banal and sensational. So while the Siza office has over the years changed and the scope of his work extends now to multiple continents, the ethics and ideas that animate imagining the evident remain relevant and resonant with contemporary work and life. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn over to Ken Frampton.
Well, this is, what can I say, rather a hard act to follow, or a series of difficult acts to follow, and I will make it sort of fairly brief, I think. I mean, many things that have already been said, and I suppose I was going to begin, and I will return to something that's already been emphasized and it occurs at the very beginning of the book, which is this staggering statement, "To repeat is never to repeat," which is combined, of course, with this warning to begin with. The obsession of originality is an unfinished and rudimentary process. I mean, I think these two things occur very early in the book, and of course, very much ought to be read together. And I thought when reading "To repeat is never to repeat," it reminded me of Roland Barthes' Répétition différente, which I think is really the same thing, basically. And also, of course, it evokes tradition. And this idea of tradition, I think, is very profound in Siza's work. And what in evoking tradition, I'm reminded of Eugenio Dawes, who is responsible for the aphorism that that which is not tradition is plagiarism, And so there's this question of what is the role of tradition in relation to imagination, in relation to seeing what as it were, is already there, which is the point that Daniela Maud said at the beginning. I mean, I think this question of tradition in relation to seeing what is already there has been approached already by other speakers, and I think one of the most interesting aspects of that is this question of references. Somewhere Siza remarks, how references or one or two references are evident in the work of a young architect, whereas in the work of a mature architect, it's hard to really identify the references because there are so many references that have been fused together, so to speak, across time and across memory. I mean, this relationship between memory and imagination is touched on here. This point made by Dal Co, this point of the relationship between imagination and interpretation. Imagination and interpretation with respect to the real. I think this is something that also Daniela has touched on, this question of the real. And So this is one of the important points that, I mean, I think you want to, just taking the book at face value, not having seen the Italian version and seeing only first the English version, I felt on reading the title, imagining the evident, that it's somehow an enigmatic, very enigmatic statement, and unpacking what it means to say imagining the evident led me to think how, and I think the writing of Siza, and of course other commentaries by Grigotti and by Monad, by Ma, explain in a way what this can be, imagining the evident in relation to the real. And it made me think how, in English at least, the word evident and the word invent both end with V-E-N-T, and how they're almost reciprocally connected to each other. In the work of Siza, to imagine the evident, or rather you could put it the other way around, to invent is first and foremost to imagine the evident. I think that the ending, V-E-N-T, in both cases is I think, a fascinating connection. And one of the interesting points that Daniela has made in her postscript to the book is this question of, her citation of Schoenberg in relation to the work of Adolf Loos, and this emphasis upon intuition. And I think one of the most interesting phrases in this postscript of Ma is drawing as an instrument of intuition. I mean, I think that is an extraordinary synthesis in a way, in looking at the work of Siza, drawing as an instrument of intuition, drawing as a way of seeing, of course, and drawing as a way of projecting. I mean, I remember that Siza once somewhere said to me a long time ago that, how to get over the panic of the white sheet of paper is to start to draw what the sight wants to be. And I think this question of what the sight wants to be, I mean, you can see that, of course, in certain early sketches in relation to the Malagaira housing at Evora. There are sketches where the housing seems to be emerging out of the ground and out of the paper at the same time, as though the mind looking at the site is imagining what could emerge from the site, so to speak, of its own accord, like a kind of inverted archaeology in a way. And that, I think, is a very, very remarkable thought and idea, and also something that architectural students ought to really bear in mind, I think. The other point I would like to make, because I don't want, so much has been said, and I don't want to go on for too long, is to talk about this issue of banality, because I think it's related, of course, as someone has already said, to seeing what is already there, but not there yet. This ambiguity between, well, it also relates to my idea of inverted archaeology in a way, to see what is already there, but is not there quite yet. This idea of creativity, which is so beautifully summed up there. But the other aspect of banality reminded me very much, and it relates actually, strangely enough. Auguste Perret had a particular view of banality. He said that the building should look as though it has always been there, So here we have this kind of reciprocal, two figures very distant in time, but over this issue of banality, where the building looking as if it has always been there could be related to seeing what is already there, but is not there yet. I mean, I think this is a kind of circle around the concept of banality. I think that's about all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. I believe that now you, Siza, would have something to say. Maybe you would want to explore this kind of this idea of banality and how it works with your own working process, because your work, one could not say that is banal, is far from a common work. So how do we deal with this contradiction?
Well, the four wonderful speeches that I heard, in them there are a lot of things that are interesting to consider, and I listen with attention, with the difficult to understand everything because of the sound, because of the language also. But I noted some special things that impressed me about the comments on some of my works. And I like Kenneth mentioned, if I understood well, a kind of archaeology
Inverted.
And that I like very much, because I find things that in my work I feel and practice. Maybe I could refer first that when I make a project, my intention always, what I look for, is that it appears inside where it goes as it had been always there. And all the suite of the studies go using doubts, first of all, and intuition as fields for studying all of them deeply to find the mistakes of each one. Doubt is very important for the development of a project. And after much time, after putting many ideas out, this is a big mistake, to find something I have a conviction, and that means beyond something that I look, imagining, I look and I say, this is the detail here in this site, like it had been always there. So it's to discover something that through my thinkings, my autocritics and so, I find that should be there. And even sometimes to imagine that the other things that are there before are influenced by what I did after. This is a little the way I work. And to speak about banality, as you said, I think I remember in one of the texts I mentioned this, to look to an exhibition of chairs in Paris, I think. And there was a big line of chairs by different famous architects. Wonderful, most of them wonderful chairs. This object that is the most difficult probably to design. One of the reasons is that there are million stairs made through centuries. Some are very beautiful, some are not, but we have in our mind, in our memory, a lot of them. And when I visit this exhibition, I looked through this file and I stopped in one. I don't know why. When I arrived to that one, I had to stop. And it was a tonne chair. And I approached and I read Adolf Loos. So it's a tonne made by Adolf Loos. You look, you have no doubt, this is clearly a tonne. But then there is something that attracts my eyes. And it's in this way that I use in a not negative way the word banality as a component needed for a result in terms of not being some brilliant idea to put in that object or in that project, but it's the result of so many things we know about the scene and why you did not put our effort in saying, and I have to do a different thing. Because when we do a different thing, usually we make then a banal thing, because there are many, many people concentrating in doing a different thing. So in a way, in a moment, there are lots of different things that become between them the same or almost same, with some tricks and some things. Well, this about banality.
Yes. Francesco, now I was thinking to address to you, because this idea of banality, I suppose that have much to do with your own participation here when you underlined this vulgarity of the play. Would you like to comment a bit more on that?
I missed one of your words, some fewer words. Can you repeat?
We were talking about banality. Siza was talking about it and how it finds like in a way of working. And I found that this is very close to what you were saying in your own communication. This idea of the vulgarity of the plea. So I think they are really close as an idea of work and even as an idea of creation, of this possibility of invention.
Well, in Siza essays and also in what he did, the idea of banality is absolutely the opposite of what we usually understand with using this word. Banality is something which is without value, which is linked to the absence of imagination and so on. Instead, in Siza is part of what you say, the evident. The evident is all what exists without meaning if we don't apply to it our imagination, our capacity of create, which is not to invent, which is completely different. For this reason, I quoted this fundamental essay by von Hofmannsthal, because he insisted on the role of doing, of making, of work, which is completely different from the romantic idea of invention we have. There was something that I would like to say about Siza. It's very clear also from what you published in your book that the works, the meaning of the work he did for the activity in Portugal after the revolution with the creation of the Saal experience and so on. It's very clear also from what he did in many of his work, which is personal attitude. But there is something which is very different from the idea we usually have of the architect, of the intellectual person, which is involved and engaged in the social historical problem, which is the idea of, again, I should use a German word, Gesellschaftlichkeit, which is to be open, to be able to be open. It's not to be friend of everybody, but just to be open. And this is completely different. And there is another and final aspect that I think that is very important to understand Siza and to understand the work, for instance, that Geselligkeit. This is socievolezza, sociability, let's say in this sense, but not something, not continuously. This attitude is part of an aristocratic attitude. What is the major characteristic of the work that he and also Tavora did? They are aristocratic. They are not populist people. They are aristocratic. For this reason, they can perceive the meaning of the banality. They can use banality because they are aristocrats. Not in the terms of you give it to the social. They are intellectually aristocrat. This is the problem, which doesn't mean absolutely the idea of the aristocrat, which is far away from our everyday problems, from the problems of the peoples and so on, from the social contradiction and so on. But that you are facing all this problem with an aristocratic attitude. Exactly what was written in this fantastic essay. Europe, the European culture is aristocratic. Afterwards can be everything, but is aristocratic. To be a great architect implies to be aristocratic. And aristocratic, first of all, and this is very clear in also obviously in the book you published, but in general, in the most beautiful Siza's work, it's aristocratic. I never saw, I would say, something which is more aristocratic of the swimming pool in Leca de Palmera. They are absolutely aristocratic, but aristocratic implies that you have a Geselligkeit attitude in the evidence, in what is banal. What is banal for everybody is not banal for Siza. The way in which he uses his stones, the way in which he uses his wood, the way in which he designed these little rooms inside of the swimming pool is absolutely aristocratic. It's stupidity to think it's just real, not to understand the banal, but to be slave of the banal, to think that this incredible, beautiful district, housing district, Alvaro, where Shushu lives, which is the name? Where Shushu lives? Shushu.
In Foz.
In Foz, exactamente in Foz. This is the most aristocratic place you can design. I mean, exactly in the same way which some of the work of Bruno Taut were absolutely aristocrat. This is simple. This is something that you should understand. I mean, when I saw the works of Tavora, it's perfectly clear to everybody who is not a simple slave of the banality, the fact that these are aristocratic works. Aristocratic and at the same time very social. Because I don't know if this is the good translation, the English word sociability, but Geselligkeit is what is the real word I would like to use.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I speak now.
Sim.
I agree with all your words. And works according to the moment, the reason they are used, have different meanings. This book is called Imagine the Evidence. And I could write another book, possibly, with the title Avoiding Banality or Avoid the Evident, to be imaginative. And sometimes we use the words in a sense and in other. For instance, when I spoke about banality in the way I speak, that is a provocative way referred to other kind of thoughts. But one thing I retained, interesting theme, when you speak about o que era que eu disse que era um tema, opening, an opening position. And I remember that when I projected, I began studying the museum in Brazil. When I arrived first time to the site, I was not happy when I saw that as a neighbor to the future building, there was a tower that I didn't like at all. Suppose 15 floors tower. And I thought, how can I do here in this small site that I have for museum, so near this tower? It's terrible problem. It's better to forget because the tower is there. When I visited first time the building already in the third floor, I arrived, I saw first time the concrete against the white concrete against this beautiful side covered by luxurious vegetation that I decided I cannot touch that. I looked at the building and of course was that the tower. And I was not so impressed. And with the continuation of the construction, each time visiting, I liked more the tower. No why immediately. Then I thought, the reason is it had broke the possible isolation of the museum. And also, when some people mention an idea of excessive protagonism of the museum, I don't agree, but there is this critic. I said no to
look at the tower.
Critics. they will look to the two buildings. So the tower became a good friend, and also made me think of the not sure result of the first thought with something, because it's not sure the first thought about how to do a building. So it's continuity, and as I told before, the doubt, the recognition of doubts as an element for the process of work.
Is it easy for you to understand when the project is working and you feel like, I've got something in hands? Does it come easy?
It is not completely working. There are always things. And one of the, for me, tragedies of situation for architecture today is that I used, years ago when I began, I would visit the construction and I would discover that would be that in that way. And then ask the builder, I don't like, I like if it was like this. And he would say, but that costs money. And looking around, I said, no problem, I'm not so interested in that thing. So you don't do that and use the money
of that to do the other.
Amazing.
The direct experience of spaces and volumes growing is a permission to discover more things. Then in the end, the project is never finished. And after we leave the project, because it's finished, other people will work on it. And so there is this continuity, again, the word continuity, which today begins to be difficult, if not impossible. I cannot arrive to work and without money needed, say, change this, because there is a director of work that has more power than the architect. And he says, no, nothing has changed. What is finished there as the process could finish in the drawings.
The project.
We use models, we use visual images, but it's not same to fit to enter. And it's always for the person that projects it. There is a dimension of surprise also. Things are not finished in that moment.
Yes, I believe that today that will be more and more difficult with this whole complexification of the building site.
Yeah,
yes.
There are two things that I notice and impress me. One is this. Consideration is that the work is finished when the drawing is made, which in a way is in the line of the few attention to the materials, the role of materials in the concept of a building, and so it's a more abstract drawing. White models is finished, and then rest is not something the responsibility of the architect.
Yes.
The other thing is when increasing happily the evolution of situations, the need of teamwork for architecture today. There are the engineers for structure, for treatment area, for this, for that, acoustic, and so, and that is good. It's good as if it is assumed as teamwork. It's very good. But many times you assume like different things making part of a project. Then the architect makes the drawing. Before in Portugal, people ask the architects risco para a sua casa, risco.
Like a sketch, make me only a sketch.
A risco, porque in Portuguese risco has two different meanings.
It's like risk.
One is
like a line, sketches, and in
risk is the problem.
A risk.
And the other risk is line, is drawing.
Yeah, so for an architect, a line is always a risk.
So,
because in Portuguese it's the same word.
So when it is a teamwork, is needed, it is very good. And very important in this development of the ideas for a building. But it is transformed in architect makes risk and then is given to engineer or a company of engineers to the risk and make as they seem better and more economic and so they make a structure project. And then treatment comes an engineer that puts a lot of grids in ceiling and so. And what I like is to talk with him and find the good solutions so that the ceiling is not a chaos of objects, more those things for fire alert, the things for view, for espionage,
for spying, like cameras, yes.
and so and so. So
yes.
talk of easy, but this idea of creating borders between everything. This is the engineer, this is the architect, so and so. That is a problem.
Of course. Yes. And I was thinking, Peter Testa, that making architecture in America might be, I don't know, I never did, might be quite different from the practicing in Portugal, and even more the practicing when you yourself were in here, a collaborator with Siza.
I think this is, yeah. This is a really interesting point. That also, I think, in describing the office, I thought it was important to bring out the model of practice and exactly what Siza's just describing right now, that students of architecture look at magazines and think that these things are transposable. But things are connected to, and this is something Siza teaches us as well, and very aware of, is that things are connected to a cultural milieu and model modes of production and social reproduction, and that it's not so easy to just move an idea from one world into another. And I think that world is now becoming, as Ken has also often spoken of, becoming globalization has made it such that the kinds of constraints that we face here in America are now everywhere pretty much, in terms of insurance companies, in terms of regulations, in terms of also the way in which the building industry is organized. And so I think this is a much larger discussion, but I think it's an extremely important one for architecture. And I think Siza, by bringing that point across repeatedly, I think is really significant, because it means that the model that I described, it was very much of an interdisciplinarity and a flat ontology, if you will, in terms of across these different crafts. And I think, just as Ken has described, architecture and the discussion today, that maybe without nature, but I would say also without some model of craft, and that doesn't necessarily mean handicraft, but that's some way of engaging the way in which things are put together, some idea of architecture as Baukunst is essential. And I think that that's the biggest challenge facing us in this age of BIM and these various kinds of building information modeling systems and blockchain distribution of materials and so forth. So I think this is something that the apprenticeship that Siza describes is essential to be able to know how to put things together. But that also, as putting together a building out of stone in the menu, I feel gave me an ability to operate across very different material systems. So I work in a very different situation, but that experience was absolutely fundamental to making it possible to think about other things that may include even automation.
Besides all this, you had in recent years quite a large experience in building in Asian country, in South Korea and Taiwan, and also in Manhattan with the skyscraper. And did you feel any constraints on your work, because they really look really much Caesars? So, and I imagine the different context of that.
First thing I could say is that working in different countries is a very good exercise in the education of any architect. By different reasons. First, we see directly things we knew about with books. And
you visit buildings that you
we know
love.
the people that are making it, the problems that have. We have talks about the dealing with the atmosphere of a town, for instance, understanding. I like very much to go without program or company, and ideally to feel in a moment most in the town, because there I have successive experiences. I began having the feeling not rigorous, but rather nebulous of the atmosphere of that town. And after that, the reasons of that atmosphere, that is already the beginning of contacts. Second thing, that constraints, when I have more, in Europe today in general, but particularly in Portugal, one thing is the increasing of bureaucracy. When we make a project, we have to submit to many departments. Each one, or the people of each one, have a part of power, and they don't want to lose that power. Then there is a fight, not only successive appreciations, but a fight between the appreciations in Portugal, but not only in Italy, in France, everywhere in Europe, except Switzerland, because it doesn't belong to European community, because some of the rules are restrictive come from European community. I am a Europeist, but I suffer much with the direction this European takes here and there, and respect to architecture much. So I had, for instance, speaking about constraints in China, and mainly and still more in Korea, I had 15 glorious years of work there. The projects were not so difficultly approved. And the main thing, the owner is always the first architect in a way. The owners wanted quality and supported much. The conditions of work were very good, and one of the elements of this condition was enthusiasm of the owners, that looking for an architect because they liked it and they wanted to work with them. So very good atmosphere during 15. Then came the virus, and everything stopped. And I doubt that it begins in the same way that I experimented this in China. In New York, it was much more comfortable for me. It was not so difficult to approve. It was not difficult to approve. There was not bureaucracy. I noticed that, for instance, if there was a doubt about some thing about regulation or implantation or so, we contacted the department in New York as possible for that, and immediately they would say, come here, day X, and we discuss that. And not me most of times, but the people in New York which were contact for me, direct contact for architecture would go and things were solved.
Mm-hmm.
And then during construction, I did not feel problems. I did not feel how is happening now much in Europe. The builders ask systematically to change the project. If they win in competition construction, and then they say, we have an alternative here, this and this, and then 2 alternatives, 3, 10 alternatives. It's incredible, horrible for the work. And New York for me was a pleasure. And also
Great.
I had the chance that the building is not high. It's not a skyscraper, does not scrape the ceiling of New York, 38, 40 floors. But by chance, the plot is narrow, and then the proportions of the building are very good in my opinion. But that was a chance. But what I see was more sure the demands, not ambiguous, sure is this.
Certain limits, okay, very objective.
And second, for development of project, we could have a dialogue with the responsible for it. And here, for instance, if I want to speak with the fireman responsible, they always say, no, send the drawings and then we give the approval. It means that we can send drawings and be approved that they change all the drawings immediately. But in the bureaucracy and rather new atmosphere of I have the power. So in opposite of the horrible ambience of dictatorship about things, now it's free, but power is fragmented.
Yes.
As everything today tends to be fragmented.
You don't know who your interlocutor is, who to call.
Yes, but I know previously that there is someone that defends his small power.
Yes, of course, I understand. And Kenneth Frampton, I was thinking that, with your work in the last 60 years, that helped us to build this idea of Western architecture. So I was thinking that in this long run that you have been accompanying practice of architecture, how do you feel that the major challenge would be in future architects? And I'm also thinking on the students that are watching us, on your Titanic panoramic view that we owe you so much. How is your perception of our future as a profession, as a craft?
Yes, it's difficult to sum it up in a few words, but I think that there is still a certain, Alvaro just spoke about it, the difference between bureaucracy in Portugal and the, in a way, surprising relative ease of his own relationship to the bureaucracy of New York, for example. which actually I find somewhat remarkable, that that the American, or anyway, the New York situation is more direct and more accessible, and also you can get at them and discuss things, etc., etc. And from his point of view, the Portuguese situation seems to be very Kafkaesque. That you just send us the drawings. We don't want to discuss anything. Just send us the drawings. I mean, this is already very negative, and so that the situation changes in different places. I think even now, despite globalization, etc., I think that there are different ways of practicing architecture in different places at different times. I've just, for example, been able to sort of expand this modern architectural critical history to look to go beyond the transatlantic Eurocentric world to other countries, well, in Africa and Asia and so on. And when one looks at that work, for example, when one looks at recent Chinese work, let's say, young generation working in the provinces mostly, because of the change in the direction of the interest of the political power has shifted a little bit away from the mega city, fortunately, to re-energize the provinces of this huge country. And the younger generation are working there and producing, I think, very, very interesting work. And well, I don't know exactly what, how they deal with bureaucracy and so on. I have no idea, because I just simply don't know. But one recognizes that the product, the culture of architecture is very alive at this particular moment there, I think, with a certain generation working in the provinces. But so it's different in different places. I mean, I think that Peter Testa is very right in speaking with considerable fear about the impact of BIM and automation on architecture, and the question of being able to create work, to imagine work in a particular place. I mean, the problem with the rationalization of production, the transformation of the building industry, is, I think, this problem that the question of the nuance, the question of nature, tends to be totally discounted. The operation is a kind of techno-economic operation, and only that. And well, then of course it's extremely difficult for the architect to be able to relate the building to nature. And this brings up another thought in my head, which is, of course, I'm actually in this beautiful book, Alvaro talks about fragmentation, the hybrid city. I mean, there's a very beautiful passage where he describes this moment when he is sick in, I think, a place called the Villanova, looking at the sea from a balcony. And he describes the experience as wonderful and as being before the fragmentation. So the fragmentation is enormous and rather universal, I think, but in the sense that the fragmentation of cities, the diffusion of the city, through unending suburbanization. I mean, this is an enormous fragmentation and extremely destructive of the relationship that Alvaro was talking about between the building and nature. I think that this is the problem today, and it's of course a problem that transcends architecture, because this what can I say, ruthless instrumental attitude towards nature is already becoming the problem. You know, I mean, this whole problem of climate change is obviously an issue that can only be mediated or mitigated through a more nuanced attitude towards development and building. And so there is this, well, in the end, of course, political tension between a more nuanced, mitigated attitude towards nature and towards building in relation to nature, and a highly instrumentalized, globalized, ultimately capitalist maximization. You know, this is what is going on in the worldwide scene, and this is extremely difficult to produce a work which has a balanced relationship with nature. So this is the challenge, I think. It's rather a lot, too much response to a, I suppose, relatively simple question, but I don't see, you know, it's a very complex situation we are living in.
Yes, of course. So maybe to finish this session, I don't know if anyone wants to say some final words, some final idea. It's already a bit late in Venice, I suppose. So I don't know if you want to say something, or anyone. And if not, we will close this session for today, and maybe some others will come. Let's see, or not. I don't know if you want to say something. The last word.
No, we could be talking by hours.
Yes.
It is not,
Yes.
it's not comfortable, but
Yes, you have to make this by parts.
I hope we will have other possibilities.
Yeah, wonderful to see you.
Presence.
Wonderful to
Let's-
see you. Yeah. See you
Why
around,
not?
everyone.
Okay, so
Okay.
thank you so much. Thank you, Francesco Dal Co. Thank you
Thank
very much,
you.
Testa. I hope to see all of you one day here in Porto, and also, of course, again at Frampton. So let's see us again one of these days. And thank you, of course, Alvaro Siza, for this sharing experience.
Well, it was great to hear everybody. It was, I think, a terrific, a very interesting event for me. Wonderful.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. And stay well, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
World.
It was a pleasure to see you
Francesco.
all.
Hey.
It was
Beautiful.
a pleasure to see you all, and I do hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, we hope so. We hope so.
Okay.
Personally, not through the computer.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.